Just after President Dwight D. Eisenhower assumed office on January 20th, 1953, deep in the middle of the Cold War, his greatest adversary died.
Moscow heads the communist world in mourning the passing of Joseph Stalin.
Stalin's iron-fisted 30-year rule over the Soviet Union had ended, and Eisenhower saw an opening. As he discussed his first formal address to the world with speechwriter Emmett Hughes, the president stopped and stared out the window as an F-86 Sabre fighter jet tore across the sky.
Address of the President to the American Society of Newspaper Editors.
The speech is considered one of his best, though not his most well-known.
In this spring of 1953, the free world weighs one question above all others: the chances for a just peace for all people.
In it, as he reflected on America's previous decades of war, both hot and cold, Eisenhower made the case for large-scale global disarmament.
Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed.
He argued that the world in arms isn't spending money alone.
It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children.
And made the case that for every weapon we buy, we give something else up.
We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat.
Eisenhower believed that America and the world had to make a change. Or as he said, the judgment of future ages would be harsh injustice.
Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron.
I'm Lacey Healy, and this, as always, is your friendly neighborhood national security podcast, Things That Go Boom. And today, the U.S. is sitting on the precipice of another great moment of potential change. One in which it's not hard to imagine Eisenhower standing up before us and making the same case he did almost 70 years ago. So on today's episode, I wanted to sit down with someone who's in a position to help us realize the perhaps forgotten potential of Eisenhower's chance for peace. Someone who's given a lot of thought to the cost of violence, both at home and abroad. Senator Chris Murphy.
Experiencing the news each day can feel like a journey. With Up First from NPR, it doesn't have to be. Welcome to 15 easy minutes of breaking news, clarity on international and national affairs, all handed over not from some floating voice in the sky, from us, Layla, A, Steve, and me, Rachel. Start your day informed. Subscribe to Up First wherever you get your podcasts.
Before we get started, I should clarify. When I say I sat down with Senator Murphy, we were both sitting down. It's just I was in my closet, my coronavirus studio, and the senator was in his car.
So I'll try to record here, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
Which led to some minor technical difficulties we figured out on the fly.
I just tried it as we were talking, and it told me I can't do it. So, so you're on your own. So if you hear a little extra noise, that's why. This is Chris Murphy. I'm a United States Senator from Connecticut, and the author of the book, The Violence Inside Us.
In his book, Murphy says it seems like increasingly America is forgetting the lessons it learned in the aftermath of the Second World War and is instead relying on brute force and the proliferation of dangerous weapons to advance our national security goals. He cites Eisenhower's Chance for Peace speech.
The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is
one of my favorite speeches of the last 100 years, in which he lays out both his initial warning about the development of the defense industrial complex, but he also talks about the trade-offs that you are making. Every time that you are buying something for the Department of Defense, you are making a choice to then not buy new school books or not feed hungry children. And while we clearly have to make a commitment to do everything necessary and spend every dollar necessary to protect this nation from attack, right now it's not clear that we're getting a return on our investment. We have been attacked, not by a foreign army, but by a virus. And so all the money that we were spending on aircraft carriers and planes and tanks and soldiers' uniforms, it didn't actually stop a foreign invader from entering this country and killing 250,000 of us. So I think it begs the question, how are we spending money right now? Are we spending in a way that meets the threats of 1950, or are we spending them in a way that meets the threats of 2020?
Murphy wonders if we should be using that money to attack domestic problems instead of leveraging so much of our discretionary spending on defense and national security. In thinking about the potential trade-offs, I couldn't help but ask if parenting two young kids while in office has changed his perspective on our policy future.
Well, there's no way for it not to color your thinking. I, of course, look at everything through the prism of my children's eyes and the world that I'm going to leave behind for them. So it's one of the factors that motivates me to work on the issue of gun violence, because I just can't stand to think that they're going to grow up in a world in which they fear for their lives going to school, and they may fear for their children's lives going to school.
Murphy's book, The Violence Inside Us, details the evolution of his thinking on gun violence, from reluctant critic to staunch advocate of reform, following the horrific incident at Sandy Hook Elementary School in his home state. And this question about his kids, I'm not just asking as a mom of three. It also gets to something that I think sets Murphy apart.
There aren't a lot of parents of young kids in the United States Senate. I can probably count on one hand, maybe 1.5 hands, the number of us who have school-age children. And, I do think that affects the debate when there are so few that are in the process of raising kids or having conversations every day with a 4-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old. I think that if you're going through that, it does color your priorities.
In Murphy's book, he makes the case that we need to reevaluate our priorities, and not just domestically. He says that if we're going to come to terms with violence inside America, we also have to talk about the way that America exports violence.
If you want the full story of American violence, you have to understand how we have brought a lot of unnecessary violence to many places around the world without much return on investment to American security.
For example, in recent years, studies show the U.S. has begun selling arms to a slate of riskier and riskier clients.
Osama bin Laden was, originally fighting side by side with forces we supported and sold arms to in Afghanistan. The UAE actually, just in the last few years, has taken weapons that we sold to them and sold them to extremist militia groups inside Yemen. In Syria, our weapons within a matter of months ended up going from moderate rebels to extremist rebels. And so, it often looks like a good idea on paper to give a whole bunch of really complicated weapons to our friends. But often our friends don't stay our friends. And sometimes our friends give the weapons to other people that aren't our friends. And I just think we have to understand that as the reality.
We've also made a series of questionable decisions about the way we use our own weaponry. In 2011, Murphy remembers traveling with a congressional delegation to the Joint Special Operations Command in Afghanistan to meet with Admiral William McRaven and his team, which Murphy describes in his book as an elite unit of terrorist hunters.
I tell the story about being at the Special Operations Command in Afghanistan and walking into, a room that looks like those you've seen in movies with stadium-style seating and massive big screens on the wall showing different special operations around the globe.
As close to a Marvel movie as you can get, he says.
At the bottom of each screen, there was the title of the country in which that particular special operation was happening.
He remembers leaning over to a colleague, confused, to ask, "Did we declare war on Somalia?" The colleague, Congressman Cedric Richmond from New Orleans, responds, "If we did, I missed it."
And I remember being kind of stunned that many of these countries, if not most of the countries that were listed on those screens, were countries where there was no declaration of war. And in fact, we were either surveilling these countries with overhead drones or actively dropping ordnance on individuals in those countries.
Murphy says this was the first time he came face to face with the idea that we're at war in many countries with no formal declaration, simply because they fall under the broad rubric of the global war on terror.
And in particular, these drone strikes that we have undertaken in lots of different places, not just Afghanistan, but Pakistan and countries in Africa, the Middle East, more often than not, they kill the wrong person. They end up hurting a lot of civilians and doing sometimes more damage to our security than benefits, in that they radicalize local populations against the United States. When these bombs fall from the sky, and kill families. So I have become a skeptic of the way in which we use drones today. And it all started from that trip in 2011 to Afghanistan, where I sort of saw the full scope of our operations and how little oversight there is over it by the full Congress.
In recent years, Murphy's come to be an outspoken leader on a range of foreign policy issues.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to speak briefly about the president's announcement today that he is going to be withdrawing 2,000 American troops from Syria. Our allies and our adversaries generally don't believe that there's much consequence for taking action against the United States or taking action in contravention of U.S. interests. This Congress has never authorized the United States military to engage in hostilities against ISIS. It is, I think,
when Russia realizes that there's really no consequence to be paid for what they did in the past, it means that they are likely to go at it again in the future.
Why I believe that both Iran and the United States do not want to enter into a conventional conflict that would likely involve an invasion that would make Iraq in 2003 look like child's play.
He says we need a more forward-looking foreign policy.
Does that mean less intervention? Does that mean changing our approach more broadly?
I think it means understanding what the actual threats are to the country and what they're going to look like for the next 50 years. We still have a national security budget that is protecting against a conventional military engagement. That is not likely to happen. I mean, never say never, but I don't think we are going to be in a conventional military war with Russia or China or Mexico or Canada over the course of the next 20 years. But there are all these new threats, propaganda operations that are trying to sow discord in our democracy, extremist groups that are recruiting online, pandemic diseases, climate change. None of those threats can actually be met with a brigade.
As the range of threats to the U.S. has shifted, Murphy says our resources haven't also shifted accordingly. That means we weren't properly prepared for coronavirus, and according to Murphy, we're still not properly prepared for things like climate change and disinformation.
So when I say forward-looking, I believe that America should still be engaged in the world. I think we can play a role for good, but I don't think we can effectively do that with the way that we spend money today on national security.
When we come back, I'll dig a little deeper into what Murphy's forward-looking foreign policy might look like and talk about how the next administration might begin to move in a different direction. Over the past 5 years, Senator Chris Murphy has written and spoken extensively about his vision for a progressive foreign policy, spelling out a set of new forward-looking foreign policy principles. Number 1.
We desperately need more economic leverage around the world. We need to supercharge the investments that America, still the world's biggest economy, can offer other nations.
Number 2.
Progressives shouldn't be afraid of new multilateral trade deals. We shouldn't forsake this tool just because we signed some bad trade deals in the past.
Number 3.
Let's get really serious about supporting existing democracies and fighting corruption in all countries, whether or not they're democratic, and protecting the rule of law first and from attack.
Number 4.
And lastly, we need to harden the State Department and USAID, and progressives should lead that effort.
The last 4 years have not tracked very closely with those principles. But one place where Murphy might have found some agreement with President Trump is on bringing troops home from Afghanistan. That is, until Trump's recent announcement that he'd make it happen by the end of his term. Murphy says he's in favor of pulling troops out. He always has been. But it has to be done on a policy schedule, not a political schedule.
It's particularly troubling in Afghanistan because we entered into an agreement with the Taliban and with the Afghan government, to a lesser extent the Afghan government, but they were in some ways a party to these negotiations. And what we said is that if the Taliban makes certain commitments, they enter into negotiations in good faith with the Afghan government, they renounce and divorce themselves from al-Qaeda, that we will pull our troops back. But the Taliban hasn't made good on their promises. And because Trump wants to get our troops out before the end of his term, he's decided to comply with his end of the deal before the Taliban has complied with their end of the deal. And it removes from Biden the leverage of our troop presence as a mechanism to try to get concessions from the Taliban. So in that case, while I agree that we need to get our troops out of Afghanistan, he's doing it in a way that really harms our security interests in the region.
Biden will also have to work within the confines of Trump's decisions on Iran.
I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
Executive order prohibiting the purchase of Iranian iron, steel, and other metals. This
will affect the energy industry and broader areas of the Iranian financial sector.
Earlier, President Trump tweeted, "These are the most biting sanctions ever imposed." He also said anyone doing business with Iran will not be doing business with the U.S. And he
remain
added all he's asked
until Iran changes its behavior.
Trump's theory of the case, and frankly, many of the opponents of the Iran deal's theory of the case, was that if we just sort of held out longer and we continued to ratchet up sanctions, we could get the Iranians to agree both to dramatically roll back their nuclear program, but also give up their ballistic missile program or stop their support for Hezbollah, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that theory has had 4 years to be tested. That's in fact what Donald Trump has been trying to do, ratchet up sanctions and try to get the Iranians to the table on a broader set of things other than just their nuclear program. And it's failed. It's failed because it was destined to fail. In fact, Obama's approach was the right one. Set aside this nuclear issue, make sure that Iran is not a nuclear power, and that makes it a lot easier to then get deals on things like their ballistic missile program.
Given Murphy's general view on Trump's foreign policy, I wondered if there was any place where he might give Trump credit for an unconventional approach. After all, he did broker a Middle East peace deal.
Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain will establish embassies and work together so strongly to cooperate as partners across the broad range of sectors. They are friends.
On Israel, it is certainly good news that there have been these recognition agreements with Israel and the UAE, and I support it. The question is, at what cost? I mean, are we now obligated to sell billions of dollars of weapons and start an arms race in the region because of those agreements? Are the Palestinians going to lose any hope of a state and be dealing with essentially a permanent apartheid arrangement inside Israel?
President Trump calling it an agreement, but it's not really an agreement because the Palestinians aren't agreeing to it.
He hasn't recognized the 1967 borders and instead is going to allow Israel to take large swaths of Palestinian land and annex the Jordan Valley.
Well, I certainly sort of celebrate the agreements and the fact that Israel does have a lot less to worry about from their Sunni neighbors. I do worry that the long-term cost to Israel's security and to American interests in the region might be significant and might be a little hard to see today.
Some analysts have also praised Trump for getting tough with China on trade. Murphy says not so fast.
Trump's China strategy was an unmitigated disaster. The sum total of Donald Trump's trade war with China was the loss of 300,000 jobs in the United States. Meanwhile, China has become more and more powerful in every corner of the globe. They are in charge of the WHO and global public health now, not the United States. They have dispensed technology like 5G all across the world with no American product that can compete with it. They have more allies than they did 4 years ago in places like South America and Africa. The Chinese have benefited more so from the Trump presidency than any other presidency in American history. It's not about whether you get tough with China. You do have to get tough with China, but Trump didn't get tough with them. He engaged in a feckless trade war that ended up in a minimalist deal.
He also tried and failed to pull China into a nuclear reductions agreement with Russia.
Trump's instinct, which was to try to get the Chinese into a deal, a trilateral format with the Russians, is not wrong. It's just that China is so far behind the United States and Russia right now. There's not a lot of incentive for them to be at the same table.
Murphy says getting an extension on our existing agreement with Russia, the New START treaty, will have to be a top priority of the next administration. New START sets limits on the number of nuclear weapons each country can have, but it also allows for information sharing that many experts say is key to preventing a new nuclear arms race. And it's set to expire in February.
It's the only remaining nuclear agreement between the two dominant nuclear weapons powers. And so I think we need to prioritize an extension, a long-term extension of New START. And then I think we need to lead by example. We do not want to get into a world in which the United States, Russia, China, and others are developing new tactical nuclear weapons. That is a disaster waiting to happen.
And Murphy says there are a lot of other disasters out there waiting to happen if we don't get our house in order. Key among the changes he'd recommend to the next administration is a major investment in the State Department.
There's a lot of really talented high-level and mid-level diplomats who left over the last 4 years. And the first task is to bring as many of those back into the diplomatic corps as President-elect Biden can. Second, we just have to plus up their ranks. I mean, right now we have more people working in military grocery stores than we have diplomats in the State Department. And it means that we are losing everywhere around the globe. I was in Dublin a year and a half ago, maybe now 2 years ago, right at the moment where the Irish government was making a decision about whether to go with the Chinese 5G network or whether they were going to go with one supported by other European partners in the United States. At the time of that decision, China had flooded Dublin with diplomats. They had doubled the number of diplomats they had trying to win this contract. The United States had one guy in our embassy who was in charge of technology, who, by the way, had no background in technology. We're just never going to win when we don't have the diplomatic power that these other countries have. So, I would argue to double the size of the State Department over the next 5 years. And I know that that may seem pie in the sky, but if you just took 1 year of increase in the Department of Defense and gave it to state instead, that would double the State Department's budget. And I think it's something that we should be thinking about.
And where would those first key priorities within the State Department go? Where would we be plussing up?
Technology diplomacy, because I think we've got to do a lot of work with our European allies to try to make sure that we're working together to develop the next set of technologies that China is going to try to shop to the world. I think you'd have a big anti-corruption capacity in the State Department that we don't have today, because right now Russia and China are just engaged in sort of old-fashioned intimidation, bribery, and graft. And we've got to be able to fight back, and personnel can help fight back. And then in the public health space, I mean, we've got to rebuild the world's public health pandemic prevention infrastructure. And that can only happen if we have scientists deployed to every hotspot in the world in a way that we don't today. So those would be a few of the areas that we're going to need to dramatically power up our diplomatic personnel.
At the core of Murphy's foreign policy prescription is a simple premise. The idea that America's current national security toolbox is failing. He believes that if we're going to tackle our real problems, the big things like future pandemics and climate change, we have to invest our money differently. And we have to do it now.
Climate change is not going to be a problem that my kids can solve, because the rate of the warming of this planet is so fast, it's happening so quickly, that if we don't make some drastic changes here in the United States, but also across the world in the next decade, it'll be too late by the time that my kids are of the age to be in positions of leadership. And so we all want to leave a better world for our kids, but there are a couple really urgent existential questions that have to be solved right now, or the next generation won't even be in a position to solve it themselves.
Things That Go Boom is produced by Inkstick Media and distributed by PRX. This episode was produced by Maren Lazian and me, and edited by Ruth Morris and John Barth. Darian Schulman is the incredible composer behind our show's music, and Robin Wise makes everything sound shiny and new. Thank you, as always, to the foundations that make our work possible: the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Colomb Foundation, Craig Newmark Foundation, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. Things That Go Boom will be out for the rest of the month on a little bit of a holiday hiatus, but we'll see you right back here on January 4th. And in the meantime, we'll be dropping in with a little something special. Stay safe, have a happy holiday, and we'll see you in the new year.
Can you hear this? Testing, testing. Can you hear that?
I can hear it great.
Jingle bell, how much fun it is to ride in a fire truck. Happy holidays. Bye-bye.
That was pretty good.